The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and with me is Dr. Gerry O'Sullivan, who is an authority on Montague Summers. And you might ask yourself, who is Montague Summers? Well, we're here to tell you that you already know. Gerry, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Rocky.
Oh, it's more than wonderful. Now, Montague Summers, why do we know who he is, but we don't know?
Well, Montague Summers is spread sort of like peanut butter all over popular culture when it comes to occult subjects. And anyone who has ever seen Lon Chaney's 1941 film, The Wolfman, rather, knows Montague Summers, because the man who wrote that screenplay, Kurt Siodmak, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, used Montague Summers' books on lycanthropy and werewolves to research and write that entire script. And so much of what is said in that film comes to us directly from Summers. It's borrowed right from Montague Summers. And so much of what we know about vampires through, say, the Twilight series, originated in the writings of Montague Summers. I do know from reading the Twilight series that the author read Summers' books on vampirism, especially the vampire, his Kith and Kin. And so many filmmakers have delved into Summers' work as the core of their research. So many of those wonderful Hammer films back from the 60s and the 70s about witch finders and vampires. I mean, it's all right out of the pages of the work of Reverend Father Montague Summers.
So are we talking about an ancient person here? When did he live?
Well, he was born in 1880. He died in 1948. He lived the early life of a very respectable, middle-class Londoner. He was born in Clifton, and he was later a resident of Richmond-on-Thames, a very lovely neighborhood just outside of London proper. And he was very much a product of his age, and yet he was exceedingly countercultural in that he was at the same time very, very modern and very anti-modern.
Can you expand on that? Now, like I said, I'm picturing, so he was a clergyman, and, we're sort of like talking about the late 19th century, and, it's kind of, I think in Europe, and it's especially during that time, and also in the United States, a lot of these themes, a lot of these occult themes, a lot of these cultural occult happenings were more than just historical anecdotes. They were actual historical events going on in that time period. They weren't just something talked about in the past. I mean, most people have heard of the Inquisition. If they haven't heard it from history books, they heard it from Monty Python. Most folks are familiar with a lot of the literature surrounding, of course, in the United States, the Salem witch trials is a popular subject of study. So the idea of witch hunters, witches, vampires, not just in cultural fictional reference, but in historical context, was still going on and was still part of the fabric of the present during his lifetime, and to some degree even after.
And very much so. And when you look at Parisian and English decadence at the turn of the last century, you see a lot of let's call it performative Satanism,
Okay.
parlor Satanism. You could get into a cab in Paris. In fact, you can get into a cab in Paris today and ask to be taken to a black mass, and more than likely, someone will know how to get you down an alleyway to some frightening ritual in a back room somewhere. Of course, it's all staged. It's all a put on. But back in Summers' day, it was very much part and parcel of decadent culture and decadent poetry. So Summers was influenced by decadence, and when he was at university, he wrote a series of poems in a collection called Antinous, which was very influenced by decadent poetry, decadent art, and also the cult of boy worship. He was very taken with relationships between older men and younger men. Part of a small circle of artists and poets who celebrated the cult of youth and the cult of masculine beauty. And that led Summers to become a very early advocate for lifting the laws banning homosexual relationships and public expressions of homoerotic sexual desire. So he was a friend of Havelock Ellis's, and Havelock Ellis was one of the early competitors of Freud's.
Okay.
Came to some very different conclusions to the conclusions of Freud. An early dabbler in psychedelic drugs and mescaline.
Wow.
A man who, there's quite a body of research that owes a great deal.
Take that, Timothy Leary.
Yeah. Oh no. Ellis was one of the first scholars to ingest mescaline and write about it, to observe the effects that mescaline had on him in the privacy of his study on a Good Friday. And he recorded his hallucinations and his feelings and his emotions, and continued his studies of mescaline across the years. In fact, very early on, it was Havelock Ellis who suggested that psychedelic drugs might have actual clinical applications.
Which is now something we've even discussed on the podcast as well. That is being very heavily researched, and there are people getting benefits from ailments from what they're calling it microdosing.
Yes.
Of psilocybins.
And there's been serious research going on into the use of psychedelics to treat drug-resistant depression at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere for quite some time. And if you had told me 30 years ago that people would be using ketamine
right.
to treat depression, I would have laughed. I mean, that was considered a quite dangerous street drug in my growing up. But now it is being produced in pharmaceutical factories and sold by prescription. And it seems to be highly effective. And Ellis and his circle, which included Montague Summers, was thinking about writing about homosexuality, which Ellis called sexual inversion. Ellis was writing about the use of psychedelic drugs. Ellis was a very early researcher and writer on transsexualism, in fact, non-binarism. And
he was I don't want to say a prophet, but he was definitely a trailblazer.
He really was. And he
ahead of his time.
Way ahead of his time. And the British Society for Sex Research was a place not only where scholars gathered to engage in sexology, the study of human sexuality, but there was also a political dimension, because many of these were respectable English professionals who wanted to change the laws and to encourage the acceptance of homosexuality in British society. And Summers was one of those people. Summers really did want to see homosexuality accepted in British society and continental society, which might strike some people as odd because of Summers' later embrace of a kind of weirdly medieval Catholicism. But he was a man of contrarieties. He was a man who could, for example, in 1918, gather with his friend Geoffrey Evans Pickering, who wrote on the ballet under the name Anatole James, for a Boxing Day Black Mass.
Wow.
And something happened at that Black Mass that caused Summers to turn against occultism, the black arts, and especially Satanism, and begin writing what amounted to these sort of anti-satanic studies and resurrecting all these old medieval books on witch finding, witch hunting.
So he pulled a 180.
He really did. And his experience during that Black Mass so frightened him, so terrified him, that he decided that he would spend the remainder of his career writing against witchcraft, black magic, demonology, and warning people about its dangers.
Well, witches, vampires, demons, all of these different, I'll call them characters just for conversational sake, all of these cultural characters have existed for centuries, and they've been depicted in artwork, in literature, and all of that stuff. And to some degree, especially in today's day, what I'll call the hyper information age, because it's not just the information age anymore. It's really going to a new level. In the these all seem like fantastical creatures, but there was a reality to all of this that hung around a lot longer than the Middle Ages. My grandmother, both of my grandmothers are from other countries. I have one grandmother from the Azores of Portugal. I have another one that was from Sicily. And in both cases, they had interwoven with their very Catholic faith a lot of syncretic magic. There was a huge amount of parallelism involving, prayers, spells, or, and remedies. One of my grandmothers, my Portuguese grandmother, was a curandera, so she made herbal cures. So there were medicines, and it was all very traditional, very root work, for lack of a better term. And these types of practices are still prevalent in many cultures today. And so the idea that, because I think sometimes when we talk in general about the vampire culture, or Eastern Europe's vampire culture, or some of the it all sounds like it's long ago and far away. This is stuff that's actually still relevant now.
Oh, very much. And the question can be asked, where does witchcraft end and prayer begin? And this was a topic that really fascinated Summers. Summers was deeply interested in witchcraft, but also because he wanted to refute the work of Margaret Murray. And Margaret Murray was an anthropologist. She was an Egyptologist by training. And she was one of the first scholars to suggest that the medieval witchcraft cult of Europe was actually a holdover from ancient pagan nature worship. And that the figure of the devil was the great horned god of European pagan worship. And that the various figures that gathered around Satan at the Sabbath were more recent incarnations of the goddess. So here you have this anthropological version of the history of witchcraft, And then you have Montague Summers writing about what I would call Gothic witchcraft. All of those familiar stories about the Sabbath and child sacrifice and the drinking of blood and all the things that titillate us when we read about and talk about the history of sorcery. The difference, of course, being that Summers actually believed that that stuff went on exactly as the witch hunters described it. Forget that these were confessional narratives taken under torture. That did not create a qualm of conscience for Montague Summers. Summers wanted to prove that these confessional narratives that were captured by the inquisitors were completely true. And this was his way of countering what was becoming increasingly fashionable, and that's the Margaret Murray school of historical witchcraft. He thought that Margaret Murray was completely mistaken, and he spent a great deal of his writings on witchcraft trying to refute her and refute her theories.
And witchcraft is still prevalent today. And in its, what I'll call its more recent incarnation, it's typically labeled as Wicca, but there are different, don't write me letters, people. I know there's more than one. Yeah, there are a lot of factions in what I'll call neo-paganism.
Yes.
And today, in fact, I many years ago, way long ago, I had a chance to speak with Raymond Buckland. And he delightful man. And may he rest in peace, because he's left us. And many people know him from what's known as, in the vernacular, as Big Blue, the Buckland's book on witchcraft. And he is sort of, along with, I would say, I would have to lump Gerald Gardner in there, sort of the fathers of the neo-pagan movement. Yes. They were the ones who were taking elements of the old religion, organizing it into something that was modern and practicable, and putting all the resources in one place. And they kind of did that, and it became Wicca. And in my speaking with him, I did note that he also, very learned guy, had he had a doctorate in anthropology, I believe, from Cambridge. And it was either Cambridge or Oxford, and I'm American, so I can say I get them mixed up. But I did ask him, I said, would it be part of a thesis maybe to sort of create an anthropology thesis, to sort of incorporate, create, and sort of put forth a new belief system, and basically see what happens when you put it up the flagpole? And he just laughed. He just laughed at me, and he told me I was a clever girl.
Well, and that's especially ironic given the fact that Raymond Buckland created an entire tradition of witchcraft out of whole cloth, Saxon Wicca. He was the man responsible in many ways for bringing Gardnerian witchcraft, British traditional witchcraft, to the United States. He and Lady had on Long Island. And he was really a part of the first generation of British and American neo-pagans.
Yeah, and it's been a wild ride, because now I'm very happy to say that it's far more accepted. People are out of the broom closet, so to speak, and they're out, and people talk about their faith, and there's lots out there. And I'm a very much a universalist. I think everybody's got a little bit of the right idea, and I think that whatever works for whomever, if they get their satisfaction on it, I think that's fantastic. And I think that just, finding ways to connect with other people, with yourself, with your higher self, with your higher power, if that's what you believe, is a way, is always going to be a positive thing. And it's interesting because Montague Summers was a clergyman. And was he a clergyman first and then got into the occult? I mean, what's the timeline on how he kind of... I get it when some people just say, I'm just into the spooky stuff, because I'm just into the spooky stuff. Some people just are. But yeah, how does that work?
Well, the old joke about Montague Summers is that he would corner you at a cafe or in a pub and whisper in your ear, "Tell me strange things."
I'm so trying that the next time I'm out. That's my new pickup line, people. All right. I
And
like that.
that's the motto inscribed on the headstone that was raised over his previously unmarked grave, an unmarked grave that he shares with his live-in partner and amanuensis Hector Stewart Forbes. And that grave in Richmond went unmarked and unnoted for many years. And a group of Summers fans, including the late Genesis Peorage of Throbbing Gristle fame and Psychic TV fame, raised the money to erect a headstone.
Well, that's
and
wonderful.
On that headstone is inscribed the phrase, "Tell me strange things."
Tell me strange things. Yes. So in his research, now when we were talking about how so much is drawn from him in movies and books, if I say to any passerby, how do you stop a vampire? They're going to say a stake through the heart. Mm-hmm. They've seen a movie or read a book, or however anybody's getting that. So, and things like the holy water. We have these, eye of newt and toe of dog. Of course, some of that's from Shakespeare. But we have this concept of these things that historically, because even though you can read a vampire novel written by any author, some element of the sterling silver, the crosses, the stake through the heart, and all of that comes in heavily influenced through this work.
Yes, and there was a interesting interchange between the writings of Bram Stoker and the writings of Montague Summers. But if you read Summers' work on the vampire, they're studies in theology, largely, because his explanations for why vampires exist, why werewolves exist, are deeply theological and very learned. But these are also studies in what I would call comparative vampirology. So killing a vampire with a stake through the heart is one way of dispatching a vampire peculiar to one set of cultural practices. Whereas what Summers does is show you across Europe and around the world how other cultures kill their vampires, how other cultures repel their vampires. And you can create a virtual taxonomy of vampire killing and vampire repelling across cultures by reading Summers' work. He was really one of the first people to sit down and catalog how communities, how cultures have historically dealt with their vampire populations. And it's fascinating stuff, because you realize that someone like Bram Stoker is only using a small piece of vampire lore, whereas there is this huge spread all around the world among various cultures of vampire stories and vampire remedies, for lack of a better term.
Vampire remedies, yes. Garlic.
Yes.
Which is delicious, though, man.
Always delicious and
always delicious.
Hated by vampires.
And porphyriacs, which I think is kind of an interesting
yes. But it depends, again, it depends upon the culture, because garlic doesn't work on vampires in some cultures.
I wonder if it works on an Italian vampire. I realize that's glib, but still,
yeah,
I'm curious.
Never know. I would imagine, though, that being an Italian vampire would be very, very difficult. Because, of course, Italian chefs love garlic.
They do indeed. But there's so much to what, though. I mean, we were kidding a little, but there's so much to this that we've all taken these as almost like cultural facts in the vampire culture, what kills them. Some of them, like I know that I read a bit, and some cultures behead them, others, were really unique about it. And you'll just have to go ahead and read some more of that text if folks want to know exactly how weird it gets. But fire comes into play, and that sort of thing. And the culture, we were talking about vampire remedies. as many of my listeners know, and we discussed earlier, I'm from Rhode Island. I'm originally from a little town in Rhode Island, and also in Rhode Island is one of the more famous vampire stories of the late 19th century, which is interesting because people, again, don't really ascribe that to quote unquote modern times. And that in Rhode Island, there are several cases, actually documented cases of vampirism or vampire hunting or that the Rhode Island vampire hysteria actually happened in the late 1800s. And it's interesting because that is concurrent with some of Montague's work. And there was a remedy. Now, the short story, and maybe we'll have to get Mike Bell to come and explain the long story one day. But the short story is Mercy Brown was a young lady who fell victim to consumption, aka tuberculosis. And as she was withering away, the rest of her family also got sick. And at this point in time, germ theory had not made it to rural Rhode Island. So people were having an epidemic and they weren't properly sanitizing. So the spread of the epidemic is inevitable. So when she expired, her brother, in his fevered delirium, claimed that she was coming and visiting him at night. And when, they went to go and check on her, and she was in a holding crypt because it was March when she died. She can't dig in March without a backhoe, and they didn't have those. She was pristine. It appeared that her hair and her fingernails had grown, and that her teeth had protruded, and it was suggested that because she was not decayed, that she was a vampire. And they proceeded, as a remedy, to dig her heart out. This is horrific. This is a young deceased girl. They took out her heart, they burnt it on a rock in the cemetery, took the ashes, and fed them to her brother as a remedy. He died a couple months later.
Worse.
But, and so these things were, and this is happening, in the 1890s, in the 1880s. This is all happening. And Vampire, His Kith and Kin, I believe, was published in 1928.
Yes.
So this is a 95-year-old text, which is still germane not only to the popular culture, but historically, as it was, being written, these things were still going on.
And they're still going on today.
And what would be an example, let's say, of something there is a modern blood fetishist culture. There is a lot of modern vampirism, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, just as there are satanic panics that are fairly regular and seem to come back every 7 to 10 years, there's a cycle to them. There are vampire panics that happen fairly often. Certainly, Great Britain has seen its share of vampire panics. The so-called Hampstead vampire is one case. You have a gentleman by the name of Bishop Sean Manchester, who claims to be a bishop in the lineage of bishops, the apostolic lineage of whom allegedly goes back to and through Montague Summers.
Oh, wow.
Which is not true, because Montague Summers was never consecrated to the episcopacy.
Okay.
So if Most Reverend Sean Manchester wants to continue to believe that, it's perfectly fine. There is no documentation, there's no evidence whatsoever that Summers was ever consecrated to the episcopacy in an independent or old Catholic jurisdiction. But Manchester has made something of a career of being one of Britain's most flamboyant vampire hunters. Okay. And Manchester has done a great deal to catalog and document more contemporary instances of vampire outbreaks. And he claims to be a vampirologist who can vanquish vampires and send them back whence they came. And he's got quite a following on social media. He has quite a following in the public. But again, his claims about Montague Summers are ridiculous. But he is connected to that Summers lineage and the sort of Summers way of describing and thinking about vampirism and witchcraft.
So this is a pedigree all of us know, but we just didn't know the name behind it.
Yes.
And it's so when we're now, you had mentioned that he lived 1880 to 1948. The work that we're speaking of, mainly the vampire, his Kith and Kin, published in 1928.
Mm-hmm.
Was this something that spread like wildfire immediately, or was his work, did it become more culturally important posthumously after he died?
Summers became more important after his passing. He did not enjoy a very large audience of readers during his lifetime. And many of his books were published in limited editions, collector's editions by presses like Fortune Press. And in fact, there's some really funny correspondence in the Summers papers between Caton, who was the founder of Fortune Press, and Summers. Summers finally had to take Caton to the courts in order to get paid for his work.
Oh my!
Yeah, Caton had a real fetish about not paying his authors. After publishing these lovely slip-cased editions that were printed on vellum and signed and numbered in limited editions, and
so he made lots of money and didn't pay anybody.
Well, he made enough money, and he stiffed his authors. And one of the authors he stiffed was Montague Summers.
Oh my goodness!
And Summers' letters to Caton insisting upon being paid are over the top.
I don't think I'd take it lying down either, though. I gotta say, it's not cool.
Yeah, and Summers was part of the shabby genteel. Very often he found himself having to sell off rare books just to make the rent and buy his food. But someone like Caton making a killing, no pun intended, off of these vampire books and then refusing to pay the author was not something that Summers took lightly. So ultimately he took Caton to court.
Well, as you know, he wrote nonfiction, correct? Or did he write fiction and nonfiction?
Summers wrote fiction, nonfiction, poetry, a number of books on literary history and literary criticism, including a wonderful study of the Gothic called The Gothic Quest, books on Restoration drama, 17th and 18th century theater. In fact, it was Summers who was one of the first critics and scholars to draw a connection between the 17th century stage and stagecraft and the fictional machinery of the Gothic castle in his studies of the Gothic novel. He had some very interesting things to say about that. And if it weren't for Montague Summers, there are a number of women writers from the 18th and 19th centuries we would not be reading or studying, notably Aphra Behn. Summers did a great deal to revive interest in Behn, and he issued a multi-volume set of Behn's plays and writings. So despite the fact that when you read his books on witchcraft, he says some pretty misogynistic things.
Witchcraft and witch pursuit was a pretty misogynistic hobby.
Always. Yes. Always. And Summers could fall prey to that as well. I mean, he succumbed to that as well. But in spite of that, he wrote quite eloquently about women writers like Jane Austen, Anne Radcliffe, Aphra Behn. He kept company with women poets. He was a great promoter of women writers and women poets. Wren Jarman, really remarkable, sadly forgotten Catholic poet who was a contemporary of Montague Summers, really was brought into her short-lived fame. She died very young by Montague Summers, who helped introduce her to publishers and helped introduce her to the editors of various literary journals and periodicals. So Summers had a great investment in promoting
the arts community. Yeah,
Yes.
that's almost unheard of at that time, because it was kind of an every man or woman for themselves. It was a very misogynistic setup where, you know, it was very difficult for a lot of time. Women would take male pen names just to get their work published.
Yes, and Summers again was
well ahead of his time,
very forward thinking, even when he was backward thinking.
It's interesting, like I said, to kind of, I have a quote from Timothy Darch Smith from the Books of the Beast in describing Montague Summers, and I found it in some of the stuff that you had sent to me, and I love this quote. I absolutely love this description, and it says, "The name of Montague Summers, its dactyl and spondy tripping lightly, almost wickedly across the tongue, seems to personify that blend of eroticism and religion, which, however reprehensible, provokes a perennial fascination in the minds and students of human psyche. Facts about his life are muddled by speculation. Rumors blur discernible outlines. The picture will probably always remain unclear. Let us see if we can uncover, though, a fragment of the original canvas." I love that. It's lofty and very, very cool, but he is a bit of a mystery. If folks are interested in reading his stuff, obviously some of it's on Amazon. If they want to get into some of the more scholarly stuff, some of the stuff that you've published, they need only to Google you and Montague Summers, and they're going to get some resources, most notably from Georgetown.
Yes, and I'm happy if anyone writes to you, please feel free to share my email address with anyone with an interest in Summers, and I will send them materials.
Oh, yes. And I can't tell you, folks, not only is Gerry a wonderful authority, he's an extremely gracious human being. And I have really enjoyed what I've read. And it has really been illuminating. Like I said, it's kind of like stuff you already are familiar with, but you didn't realize where it had gotten sourced from. And that's really kind of opened it up. And that's for all of you. That's for horror fans. That's for, you know, any folks that have any interest in the occult, why people believe what they believe. Because his writing is very much, you can get the sense that he's also a student of human nature.
Very much.
And it makes more sense. I think it also makes it very readable too. Because I know sometimes this can sound dry. Even though it's spooky, it's still dry.
Oh yeah. Well, and Summers really was a scholar, and he was a Hellenist and a Latinist. He taught classical studies. He taught classical languages. He spoke fluent Italian, but he thought and wrote as a scholar would think and write. And despite the fact that these were books about witches and vampires that were published for popular consumption, they're deeply theological in their orientation, and full of purple prose. Summers was the master of purple prose, but he really felt that he had to overwrite in order to convince people that these stories were true.
Right.
And if you read my prologue to the new critical edition of The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, you'll see in there that my fascination with Summers started as the result of a pilgrimage, really, to the grave of Harry Houdini.
Oh, wow.
And I picked up a copy of The Werewolf at a bookstore not far from Machpelah Cemetery, where Harry Houdini is buried, and read it on the train going back home. I grew up in New York City. I'm from the Bronx originally. I asked my father to drive me out to Harry Houdini's grave, and in those days, driving from the Bronx to Brooklyn was sort of like taking a rowboat to Timbuktu. So my dad sat down with me with a subway map, and he gave me a roll of tokens, and he basically said, "You're on your way. Yeah, good luck." And this is New York in the 1970s. This is when the taking of Pelham was quite popular, and
Son of Sam was happening.
Yeah, that was the Summer of Sam. This is before 1977, but my dad thought nothing of putting me on a train and saying, "Go forth, young man." And I found my way to Brooklyn, and I found my way back, and I returned intact and with a green-bound copy of Montague Summers' The Werewolf in my hand, and I sat on the subway car and read that book, and it scared the bejesus out of me. And I went to see my local librarian to find out what I could about this man named Montague Summers. There was no biographical information available. None. And the only book that appeared about Summers was very conjectural, and it was written under the pen name of Joseph Jerome by Father Brockert Sewell, who was a Carmelite who was fascinated by Summers. And Brockert Sewell was a literary scholar himself, a fine poet, a great writer. And very early in his career, he caught a glimpse of Montague Summers and his little dog, Agrippa, and became fascinated by the figure that Summers cut. And he began investigating his story and researching his story, and he put together a very lovely little memoir about Montague Summers, based largely upon second and third hand information. But I didn't find that book until much, much later. So happening upon the missing papers of Montague Summers, which went errant after Summers died in 1948, was an absolute pleasure.
And how did you end up finding that collection?
It was following a series of conversations on computer bulletin boards among folks who were fans of supernatural fiction. And someone mentioned that they had happened upon boxes of moldy papers sitting in an attic in Winnipeg,
Canada.
Yes. And
okay.
I followed up and I started my investigation, and I located the owners of the papers, and I flew up to Winnipeg, and I was the guest of some very lovely people. And the owner of the papers was the niece of Hector Stewart Forbes.
Okay, which was his companion.
Yes. And the papers had made their way to two spots in the world. A large portion of the collection went to Canada, and a smaller portion of the collection went to Australia. And there were various parts and parcels that ended up in England. All of those papers were stored in trunks at the Sotheby's warehouse after Summers died. And over the years, people rifled through the boxes and the trunks. And we don't know why. We don't know if this was just petty theft and vandalism, or if there were other forces at work. We do know that Montague Summers dined with Aleister Crowley twice, and that he was fascinated by Aleister Crowley.
Who wouldn't be?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I'd have dinner with him. I'd be curious. Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. Although it's very funny because a lot of writers on Montague Summers claim that Crowley and Summers were friends. Summers was very suspicious of Crowley, and he really thought that Crowley was a genuinely evil person. And he kept a huge portfolio of clippings and correspondence and primary research materials about Crowley. Some of it, I believe, very incriminating. And I have a feeling, and I urge anyone who's interested to contact me. I will send you a copy of my article. But politics in England being what they were during the Cold War, especially in the 50s and 60s, there were various figures who trafficked with the occult and knew Aleister Crowley. And I believe that thanks to political intrigue and thanks to opposition research, the people were looking to link some very well-known English politicians to Aleister Crowley. And I think that someone got into Summers' trunks and crates and made off with his big old file on Aleister Crowley. Because it's nowhere to be found. He was no fan of Crowley's, though he was fascinated by Crowley. And in some very interesting ways, he and Crowley were of like mind, though Crowley admitted it. Summers never would.
That's fair. I get it. It's interesting. So, like, he had done all this occult research and had interviewed with people and all that type of thing. Yet, it seems to be a fact and evidence that when he a stipulation of his funeral was that he was not to have a requiem mass. What's that all about?
Well, because the Catholic Archdiocese of London knew about the stories circulating about Summers' involvement in occultism, possibly being involved with, if not himself directly, with pederasty, hanging out with pederasts, and having possibly irregular religious orders from an independent or old Catholic bishop. There was a real hesitation on the part of anyone affiliated with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of London to bury Summers with a full requiem mass. He had a simple gravesite service, and that requiem mass was withheld from him by the Archdiocese.
He was okay. Persona non grata. Their idea.
Yeah, it was. Believe me, Summers was a scholar of liturgical practice and liturgical music, and he's a man who loved liturgical music. And I can only think that Summers imagined his Bon Voyage liturgy as something quite fabulous and wonderful. And he must have been quite let down in the afterlife to think that he was denied a full requiem mass by the Archdiocese.
I think the foray would have been beautiful.
Yes.
Now, something else. He haunted his assistant?
Yes. He haunted not only his assistant, but he haunted the family that took possession of the boxes of papers.
How about you? Did he haunt you?
No.
No?
No, I think I'm too boring to haunt.
Come on now. No, it's interesting. So what kind of experiences are recorded as far as where because the papers, I assume, are stored in some place important and scholarly now, and in an archive.
They're beautifully archived, thanks to the generosity of the folks at the Georgetown University Library and the Booth Library Special Collection. There's a wonderful finding aid, very, very clearly delineated. And the collection is there for anybody to visit and look at who'd like to. And that's really where they belonged all along, not moldering in an attic somewhere.
So has anybody reported any unusual happenings at the archive?
Not to my knowledge, but I'll find out when I'm down at the
there you go.
Library at the end of October.
And what happened with the family and his assistant? I'm curious.
Well, Hector Stewart Forbes was somewhat obsessed with the ghost of Montague Summers. He believed that the house in which Summers died was obsessed, that there were poltergeist activities that he reported, strange sounds at night, your sort of standard ghostly apparitional sounds and such.
Garden variety haunting.
Well said. And the family that took possession of the papers in Canada reported that the first night the papers were in the house, one of the children saw a luminous figure of human shape and proportion near the papers. And it caused quite a stir in the household.
I'm sure it did. Again, folks, you can look up Gerry's work online. If you go in and you input Gerry O'Sullivan, Montague Summers, you're going to get quite a bit of information. And as always, you can contact Gerry directly. If you want to tell folks your email, you can, or if they can just come through me, whatever is easier for you.
Well, why don't folks reach out to you, Rocky?
Certainly, yes.
And you have my blessing to share my email address with anyone.
There we go.
With an interest in Montague Summers. I'm
absolutely
looking to connect with Summers scholars.
Yes, and people who are I think there's a lot of sincere people that are curious. I know I have a lot of listeners from. I'm blessed that I have some from all over the world, and there are still artifacts and articles that are missing. Yes. Anybody got the Crowley file? You got to write in.
Contact me, please.
If you find that Crowley file, I wonder if Ozzy Osbourne has it.
I doubt that very much.
Okay, it was to hoping, but
I'd call Jimmy Page if I were
Jimmy. You know what? I got him mixed up. My apologies to the Osbournes. Jimmy Page was the one who lived in his house
in Boleskine. Yeah, and
that's what I was trying to remember.
It burned down.
I had heard that. That's crazy. It's a stone house. How does that burn?
From the roof down, and the floorboards burned, and a lot of damage was done. But there was a fund to restore the house, and they're well on their way to restoring Boleskine House.
And it's an amazing location,
right on Loch Ness.
Yeah, it's incredible. So we were just talking about Georgetown, and we were talking about your work. Let folks know what you're doing coming up, because this is going to air starting October 27th. So folks, if you have a chance to attend your event, tell us a little bit about what's going on.
There is an exhibit at the Georgetown Library featuring Montague Summers and highlighting the collection. And I have been asked to go down to Washington, D.C. and give a little talk on Summers on October the 30th, the day before Halloween. So my wife, Leslie, and I are going down there, and we're going to meet all the folks who've done such a wonderful job gathering the papers together and cataloging them. And I will give a little lecture on Montague Summers and entertain questions and have a good time. So looking forward to it. I can't think of a better way to spend the evening before Halloween.
AKA Mischief Night. Isn't that Mischief?
There you go.
In some
We're
places.
Gonna make some mischief. Yes.
Gonna make some mischief. And what I'll do is I'm gonna go ahead and grab the link for that event, and I'm gonna put it in the description. So if folks are curious about that event, just go ahead and click the link in the description. It'll take you to more information. And we'll also have some links to the Georgetown page on Montague Summers as well.
Wonderful.
I want to thank you so much. It has been a pleasure, and it's nice to know where some of this information comes from and the impact that this had culturally. And any final words on Montague Summers for us?
Rocky, it has been a real pleasure, and thank you. You are a wonderfully gracious host, and I would urge anyone interested in Summers to investigate Summers' work and try practicing saying the words, "Tell me strange things."
Tell me strange strangers. Things. Yes, I have to start doing that. It's going to get me into trouble, but I'm okay with that.
There you go. And it is Halloween, so...
It is. 'Tis the season, as they say.
That's right. The most wonderful time of the year.
It really, really is. Thank you. And I agree with you there. And to all of you folks, we all hope that you have a wonderful, safe, and happy Halloween. And we shall see you soon with another episode of the Macabre World podcast. Until then, stay kooky out there. Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.